Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and today we have a brand new movement to dive into. But before we get started, I just wanted to speak quickly about my Patreon. Patreon is a membership platform that makes it easy for listeners to support their favourite podcasters and content creators. And this week, I made a few changes to my own Patreon. You can support the show from as little as £1 a month, which will get your name listed on my section of sponsorships on the cultvault.com website, or for ad-free and exclusive content, there is a £5 a month option. For the top tier supporters, there are memoirs and books sent directly to you with a percentage of your pledge going to the Take Back Your Life recovery programme, where the money is used to sponsor and assist in the recovery of other survivors. You can find me at patreon.com/thecultvault or follow the link in the episode description. Every supporter ensures that I have the ability to continue putting out weekly content. To those of you already here and pledging, thank you so much. This really means the world. Now on to today's topic. Daniel is here to talk to us about his personal experiences in a movement called KwaSizabantu. Please be advised that this episode does come with themes of child abuse, shunning and physical assault. Now here is Daniel. Hello Daniel, and welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today. We're going to be looking at a new movement in this episode, which I am eager to bring to the listeners. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to everybody listening?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited to be here. I've really enjoyed what I've heard so far from the podcast. In fact, it became sort of my go-to listening in the car on the way to and from work for a while. So I feel like your voice is very familiar already. So yes, my name is Daniel Schricker. I'm a composer and writer based in Adelaide, Australia. And at the moment, I mostly work as a music tutor, so teaching school kids. My father is American and my mother is originally from New Zealand. But they met and got married in Germany. So that's where I spent the first part of my life. And then I briefly lived in South Africa before my family moved to Australia when I was 8 years old. So I went on to do undergraduate and postgraduate studies in music composition. But recently I've started doing some writings about a cultic group, which I had personal experience with, partly just because I've always had an interest in psychology and theology and things of that nature.
That is an incredible introduction. I've just written so many countries down here: America, New Zealand, Germany. You're talking to me from Australia now. And,
That's right.
And then you mentioned South Africa in there as well. So do you think it might be possible that you've visited almost every continent in your life?
Yeah, I suppose so. Took me a while to get to Asia, and I've only sort of been to Singapore on a stopover, but I got to do a lot of traveling at a young age, so I was fortunate in that respect.
That is incredible. Have you had any particular favorites or places you'd love to go back to?
I have a kind of a nostalgic attachment to Germany just because it was the place where I spent, most of my childhood. So I always really enjoy going back there. But yeah, other than that, not really anything that comes to mind.
Another interesting point as well is that you are 10.5 hours ahead of me, which was really difficult for me to get my head around for a little while. And if you were in Germany, you'd be 1 hour ahead of me. So we would have been slightly different on the time zone scales, because it's early in the morning here and late at night where you are. So it's so
That's
interesting,
right, yeah.
That all these different countries you've named. I think America has like 3, 4, 5, maybe 5 different time zones. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
exactly.
Something like that. Yeah.
So all of these places you've listed, we would have had a task to try and work out the right time to chat, which again is interesting in itself. And you mentioned that you were a music tutor working with children. That sounds like probably quite a tiring position, but also quite fulfilling at the same time.
Yeah, no, I enjoy it. You just get a lot of different experiences with the different personalities that you teach and that kind of thing. There's been a few extra challenges with COVID and things like that the last couple of years when it comes to, those sorts of jobs. But yeah, no, I really enjoy working with kids.
Have you had to do like a lot of of online tutoring. I can't imagine how that must work out if you are tutoring music and not being able to sit next to the person that you're teaching.
Yeah, it's definitely more challenging. I've gotten used to it partly because I have one student that I teach permanently via Zoom because they live a little bit further out in the country. So yeah, you sort of make the best of things, and yeah, some things are just going to be a little bit more challenging that way.
And you mentioned then that you've kind of started to dive into writing about and speaking about one particular group that you have had personal involvement with, and that is going to be the basis of our interview today. So would you like to just let the listeners know the name of that group?
Sure. So the group is called KwaSizabantu, which is a Zulu word that actually means the place where people are helped. And I'll leave it to the listener to decide throughout the course of the interview whether the name is a misnomer or not, but I see a certain sense of irony now with the name.
So that pronunciation is KwaSizabantu.
That's right. A lot of people that were part of it, it very often got shortened to KSB. So if that's easier to say, that's fine. I'll probably be referring to it as that at some point.
Right.
Well.
Before we jump into talking about this particular group, KSB, you have a doctorate, that's right, isn't it?
Yes, in music composition.
So I was going to refer to you as Dr. Daniel, but we decided to leave that out and be a bit more casual and laid back. But I did just want to let everybody know that I am speaking to Daniel today, who does have a PhD, which I just think is so incredible and definitely worth mentioning for a number of reasons that I'm sure we'll discuss later. First and foremost, because we try to address the stigma of the quote unquote type of person that might be involved in a high demand group, but also the misconceptions of what a person can achieve when they actually leave this type of group. So Daniel's talking to me from a position of actually holding a PhD that he has gone out and has gained himself and has those extraordinary credentials. So I wanted to highlight that before we get into things. But now that we've kind of addressed that and we have Dr. Daniel here to talk us through the KSB, can you tell us a little bit of history around this group? Who founded it, and when or if changes in leadership since its birth or implementation happened, and the core principles and practices?
Yeah, absolutely. So the group was founded originally by a man called Erlo Stegen, and it was founded in 1970 in KwaZulu-Natal, which is in South Africa. Now, Erlo Stegen, he was a traveling evangelist in the 1950s and 60s, and his ministry particularly centered on the Zulu people. And after a period of about 12 years, he became dissatisfied with the lack of success in his ministry, and he became somewhat desperate to experience some kind of a spiritual breakthrough. And he claims that in 1966, God came down in a special, tangible kind of way in what they allege was a religious revival. And so the group claims that at the time of this revival, there were mass conversions of Zulu people to Christianity. There were claims of people being supernaturally healed. There was even one woman that they claim was raised from the dead as well. Now, I hasten to add that there are credible sources which debunk many of these alleged miracles. So it is worth regarding the accounts with some degree of skepticism. But as far as the members of KwaSizabantu are concerned, this is all very real, and this is what they use to justify their entire belief system and the organization as a whole. So essentially what happened after this alleged revival was that the work gained enough traction that they were able to found this mission station. So this is still in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa as well. And this mission station now houses a number of commercial endeavors. So they've got an extremely lucrative water company, which is very well known within South Africa. They've got various agricultural projects. They've got a Christian school, teachers training college, and a number of other pursuits. And so these are all located on this particular mission station, which is essentially an enclosed compound. And so after the beginning of the ministry, Erlo Stegen brought in a fairly well-known Christian author by the name of Dr. Kurt Koch to write books about this alleged revival. And those books ended up being published. And it was the publication of those books which led to an expansion of the work into Europe. And that initially took the form of annual conferences, which were attended by several thousand people usually. So they took hold relatively quickly as well. And the religious context in Europe at the time was such that you had a lot of Christians who were caught between the extremes of the charismatic movement on one side, and then on the other side, the antinomianism of the more nominal expressions of Christianity. So there was something quite appealing about this passionate and compelling speaker from South Africa who was claiming this very experiential form of Christianity. And so I think one thing that was particularly attractive to a lot of people were these rather exotic stories of the supernatural healings and the exorcisms and the resurrections and that kind of thing. So it didn't take very long for it to gain traction there in Europe. And so eventually the conferences led to the formation of a number of churches and schools within Europe as well, which were part of the KSB franchise. And so then one other location, which is the one that I had the most to do with, was the KwaSizabantu Church in Australia. So I was there between the ages of 8 and 17. So that's a little bit in terms of the history. In terms of changes to the leadership, the fundamental leadership structure hasn't really changed that much. There's a couple of exceptions to that, but essentially it's still the same as what it was back in the 1960s. So the leader, Elo Stegen, is very old now, and he has severe dementia as well. But the rest of the leadership of the group deny that his cognitive faculties are faulty. So officially, he's still the leader as far as they're concerned. Realistically, his dementia is serious enough that you rarely see him make an appearance anymore. And he never preaches because he's just not coherent enough to do that. There's a lady called Lydia Dubé who seems to be unofficially in charge of the group. She was the woman who claimed that she was resurrected from the dead at the start of the alleged revival. So she had a fair bit of force behind her personality and, her religious experience to make people look up to her. So perhaps the most important change in the leadership structure in recent years was that they excommunicated the leader's brother, who was always one of the most senior leaders of the group. But he was always subservient to Elo Stegen, but he was definitely very high up in the hierarchy. And so that was quite a big thing as far as I'm aware. And unfortunately, he recently passed away. So he was in his 90s as well. So then in terms of the core principles and practices, as I've mentioned, probably the thing that underpins the entire worldview for the membership of KwaSizabantu is this concept of revival. So that's the thing that gives them their sense of elitism in particular. So they feel that they've got this very special revelation from God that happened at the time of the revival. And they even go so far as to claim that this revival is ongoing. And in terms of psychological control, they use the concept of revival to subdue any dissension on the part of the membership. So they argue that because this is a divine work of God, that makes them unassailable, and to question the leadership is therefore to essentially question God himself, So it's kind of a guaranteed way for the leadership to maintain very tight control of what the membership is and isn't allowed to do. So then in terms of the practices, probably the one that really jumps out initially is this concept of confession of sin. And this, of course, is a concept that's not foreign to Protestant or Catholic Christianity. But there are some very distinct differences when it comes to KwaSizabantu. So within the KSB paradigm, the way you make it to heaven is not by believing in Christ, as is the historical position of Protestant Christianity, but you have to confess every sin you've ever committed to one of the leaders of the group. So they feel, and these leaders, they'll refer to them as counselors. That sort of sounds a little bit more innocuous, I suppose. And so they indoctrinate the membership to feel that their sins can only be forgiven if they're constantly confessing them to the leaders of the group. Not to do so literally puts you at risk of eternal damnation. This is what they would claim. So they currently have a lot of testimonies from both adults and children on their website who claim that KwaSizabantu unlocked this secret of confession for them, and that they will go to hell if they don't keep confessing their sins to the leaders. So they also made confession of sins mandatory for the school students at one point. I'm not sure whether it still is, but and yeah. So as I said, it's there's a number of problems to that aspect of their teaching, not only theologically but also the psychological elements of fear and control that that are part of that system. So then the second point that I think is particularly interesting in terms of their belief system, because again, it's very distinct from what most people think of in terms of a normative evangelical Christian experience, is the way that they get married. So at KwaSizabantu, they don't allow any contact between the opposite sex. So boys and girls are very much kept separate. You're not really supposed to talk, definitely no texting, and absolutely no dating. I mean, these were some of their most prized rules that they enforce very seriously. So what happens in terms of marriage at KwaSizabantu is that people get married through a very regimented set of steps. So the man gets to choose a woman that he fancies. Now, this is normally based primarily on looks or position within the organization, but they would always frame it in such a way that the men would claim that God has shown them to marry a specific woman. So what would then happen once a guy had selected a woman, he would go to one of the leaders, usually Alo Stegen himself, and then Alo would propose to the woman on the man's behalf. The woman would be told to keep the proposal a secret, even from her family, and she would then be told to go and pray about it. And she could then decide whether she wanted to accept or reject the marriage proposal.
Right, so she did have some level of decision or say in that situation.
She did. Having said that, there's different stories about the level of pressure that was put on people. But absolutely, as a general principle, they weren't arranged in any sense. The woman did have some say to turn down a marriage proposal, and that was okay.
That information control is, but keeping things from your family like that, and the pressure of the leadership coming to you and proposing on the man's behalf, I feel anxious already.
Yeah, it certainly caused some problems. So if the woman then decided to accept the proposal, what would happen is the couple would get engaged in a church service in which Alo or one of the leaders would stand in between the couple. So again, they were symbolically even trying to keep the couple apart as kind of an example to the other young people. And the leader would even be the one that put the ring on the finger of the girl. And so the first time, even while they were engaged, they still weren't allowed to have contact with each other. So no dating, no texting, no talking. The first time they spoke and held hands was at the wedding ceremony. So you can imagine the psychological effect of this in terms of what is being asked of the women, especially on the wedding night, So, and particularly because the whole concept of women submitting to their husbands was taken to include the sexual aspect of the relationship. So in effect, you had couples getting married that were complete strangers. And, it's important to emphasize that this way of getting married was, this rule was enforced so severely that any deviation would literally result in expulsion from the group. So I know of families that have, parents that have alienated and cut off contact with their children simply because they chose to marry outside the group and chose to get to know their future spouse. That's probably the second big thing that is quite distinct about KwaSizabantu. Then the final thing that I think is worth mentioning is just the entire group is characterized by an extreme sense of sectarianism and elitism. They regard anybody who leaves the group as apostate, even if they remain Christians or remain religious in some sense, because they would say that, this person has seen the light of the truth, but they've rejected it. So they feel justified, consequently, of shunning that person, And they generally look down on outsiders anyway, just in general, because they don't have this revival, which they always refer back to. And also because outsiders don't follow the same specific set of rules which they pride themselves on at KwaSizabantu. So you have the effect of this kind of sectarianism, where there's this very strong insider-outsider mentality, which is unfortunately fractured countless families who were split when some people left the group and other people chose to stay loyal to it.
Do you feel like the attitude towards people who have been members of the movement and then decided to leave is somewhat worse than people who have never encountered the group in the first place, because they were in the place of the truth and they've walked away from it, whereas people like me who have never been in contact with that group, I wouldn't know any different. I haven't been introduced to the truth or the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. They would regard with a lot more contempt somebody that's been part of the group and has left, irrespective in a sense whether you've grown up in the group or whether you were part of the group by choice for a while and then chose to leave. Like, as soon as you're considered part of the inner circle enough to really be a proper member of the group, they're extremely disdainful of you if you then choose to leave. And essentially most of the time they'll just cut off contact with you if you leave, because you're no longer supporting the mission. So. And
the communities that are involved with KSB, are they generally quite insular and rural, in the sense that if somebody was to be cut off, they might find themselves further isolated or stranded, and sort of without a support network or other place to retreat to if they no longer had contact with family and friends?
It probably depends which sector of KwaSizabantu you were a part of. So for me, being mostly part of the Australian branch, there wasn't so much of a sense of isolation from the rest of the world. In South Africa, yeah, there probably would be more of a sense of that. I'm not 100% sure, actually. I think it would probably depend on each individual family as to how they would view that.
Absolutely. And I think that is universal across the new religious movements that we speak about, that do practice or have policies of shunning included in their doctrine or their practices. And a lot of the time it comes down to the discretion of the families. I believe sometimes the families feel like they have no choice but to follow the correct procedures. Often I think families may look the other way and be quite discreet in keeping contact with the family member or loved one who has decided to walk away, or who has been disfellowshipped, or who has been shunned. And that leaves a big gap to question the efficacy of the doctrine itself, because if people are discreetly not following those rules to the letter, and nobody ever finds out that's happening, what are the repercussions for that? Are there spiritual repercussions, or are there personal repercussions because you are not following your faith correctly in the way that the leadership is telling you to? Or perhaps there is no repercussions or consequences for that decision to kind of keep contact with that loved one, but keep that on the down low. And this is a big thing that comes up when we discuss the movements that do practice shunning, because of course it's a potentially lethal practice, as we have heard about with a lot of the Jehovah's Witnesses and the coverage that we've done on the show, including that particular faith. But this religion is definitely a new religious movement, because the 60s, I mean, they were somebody put a thing up on the internet the other day that said we are closer to 2050 than we are to 1990, and that like I had to take a second to be like, oh my goodness, the 90s were like 10 years ago, but they weren't. So I know that I say the 60s weren't that long ago, but they were further back than I think my mind lets me realize, but still relatively new when we're talking about religious movements and the amount of people that practice them, and having, as you mentioned, their own texts printed and used further afield. So KSB, although it came to be officially in the 60s, has spread out further afield since then. You've just mentioned that, you know, in South Africa it may be slightly different to what it's like in Australia, but there's so much that you said in that introduction that I wanted to go over to see if you could offer any insight into some of the main points.
Sure.
So it's my understanding that missionary work started over in Africa in the late 1800s. And when we talk about South Africa, I think, and I might be wrong here, but it's mostly populated by people who are white in color. And I had a conversation the other day about whether white or Caucasian is the right term to use, but actually on every government and federal piece of documentation where you declare or you state your race, it gives you the option to use white. It doesn't give the option to use Caucasian. So I'm not sure what the correct term is. If somebody has an idea of what the correct political term is, please get in touch and let me know, because I always stumble and feel kind of nervous and uncomfortable when addressing that particular subject. But it's my understanding that white missionaries went over to Africa originally in the late 1800s. And started to set up ministries and churches. And I think it only started with a small number of missionaries, but then over time, as we know from the episode I released just last week on the Assemblies of God, a lot of families move over so that the fathers can become preachers and pastors and start their own ministries and start their own missionary work over in Africa. And we're talking about South Africa particularly. And I'm not sure of the specific history of South Africa or how it came to be mostly populated by people that are predominantly white. I don't know if you have any information on that or insight into how that happened and whether it is linked to the ministry movement and the Christian church.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure either. I've been reading some interesting things just about the context in which the leader of KwaSizabantu grew up, because it seems like he was mentored by, I believe it was a Lutheran pastor or something like that. And of course, you also have this very strong Dutch Reformed heritage in South Africa now in terms of the religious context as well. It seems like South Africa also became a little bit of a melting pot in terms of religious beliefs. So another interesting series of articles that I've read recently was it made the claim that there were elements of Zionism that found their way into Alosting's thinking early on when he was kind of creating the KwaSizabantu belief system. So yeah, it's difficult to say exactly what the main influences were for him, and I'm not 100% sure on the connection in terms of the history of South Africa, how that would factor in this case.
I just decided to have a quick Google so that we could put an answer to this question, and it mostly seems to be political or economic turmoil in respective homelands that caused a lot of migrations to happen over to South Africa. But it does also include a lot of missionary work and the Christian faith being included in those groups of people that did migrate to South Africa. So that does kind of make sense and does work in conjunction with what we're talking about today. But something else that was interesting that you mentioned was that this particular new religious movement actually owns a water company. And as I see over here in England a lot of the time, there is a huge shortage and need for clean water in a lot of parts of Africa. So if you're going to have or build an empire, I suppose in that part of the world, that would be the line of profit that you might think about taking if you had access to the equipment in order to build a water company.
Yeah, although in the case of KwaSizabantu, they actually didn't discover the the spring which led to the establishment of the water company until about 1996, I believe. So it wasn't kind of part of the economic structure of the mission up until the mid to late 90s. They've had other like agricultural and commercial endeavors prior to that. So I think originally the goal of the leader was to be self-sufficient, essentially. So, but yeah, the water company Equelle expanded. I mean, it's a multi-million rand enterprise now, you know, so it brings in a huge amount of profits for the mission station. And recently, with a lot of the investigations taking place, there's been quite a lot of debate about, you know, the question of whether the workers are being underpaid and just some legal issues surrounding the condition of the workers, essentially.
And that, again, is not unique, I don't think, to KSB. We see a lot of labor trafficking, child labor trafficking in a lot of these movements. But I suppose in I'm not sure what government legislation looks like in places like Africa, South Africa, or even Australia. So that would be a really interesting conversation to have around laws of labor trafficking.
Well, and especially in the context of a religious organization where you have, if it's operating under the guise of a church, you have the whole question of tax exemption. And again, I'm not much more familiar with South African policy than you are, but so yeah, and that was actually just fundamentally one of the problems, I think, with the business ventures of the mission group, is that they still build themselves primarily as a religious organization, but of course now they're this multi-million-dollar commercial enterprise as well. And there seems like they didn't do a very good job of demarcating those things as separate entities. So, and I might go into that a little bit later on as well, but there were some instances where there was kind of a blurring of the lines between the religious policies and the legal policies within some of the companies.
I think, again, we've seen that so much in things like the Unification Church, who I believe are still the #1 sushi provider across America.
Oh, really?
And they had the Washington Times. There's often religious and faith-based part of an organization, and then the business and profits building side, where the fancy cars and the nice buildings all over the world come in, and then we really start to question the tax exemption status and the perks that leadership may be accessing in terms of the money being raised, especially if a lot of that money is coming from people who are members of or congregants of that particular faith-based group. But something else that you mentioned as well, around one of the strange things or practices around this movement is the whole idea of confessing to leadership, and that to me is strange, because are the leaders appointed by somebody with significant status? We often are told that the Pope is supposed to be like a representation of God on earth. So if people were to confess to the Pope, then I might be able to understand how they are then kind of able to, or people appointed by the Pope. So when you confess all of your sins and everything in life to somebody in leadership of KSB, are they chosen by a particular person? Are they seen as holy themselves? What gives this person that power to then take your confessions and make you pure or fully confessed?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question, because KwaSizabantu never really appointed like a formal eldership structure within the group. So my impression was that it was slightly random in the sense that as long as you made a good impression on them, I don't even know if they like officially appointed people. It's sort of just, you know, once you were accepted into the organization and you were deemed spiritual enough, I suppose would be the defining factor, then you would be, you know, allowed into a position where you hear confessions. Yeah, I don't know if there was much more to it than that. I mean, it would be an interesting question to talk to somebody that kind of went through that process. But yeah, I'm really not sure.
The whole wedding ceremony aspect, we mentioned a bit before about some reservations that I felt when you were talking about how the woman was supposed to keep so much information from her family. But the ceremony itself is very bizarre in terms of the customs and practices that I'm more familiar with over here in England. It almost feels as if there are some tribal rituals or tribal culture aspects that are working alongside Christian practices. That there's a wedding ceremony with the man and the woman, which feels very Christian. But then there's also things like the man chooses the woman, and then she is to go and pray and see if that feels right for her, and that feels almost other than Christian.
No, that's absolutely right. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why I highlight it, just because it is something that is so different from, what most people would think of in terms of like a normal Protestant evangelical church. Now, the interesting thing with a lot of these really deeply held beliefs within KwaSizabantu is that a lot of them, the way they came to them was because somebody had a dream or a vision or something that they interpreted as a message from God. So I don't know. I mean, there was an annexing of aspects of Zulu culture, for example, as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But in a lot of cases, it was really just that, somebody came up with the idea and felt that this was God saying that they had to do it this way. And then over time, it became more and more solidified within the worldview that they occupied. So, and the other thing worth mentioning is that the entire belief system, and this is perhaps where a tribal sense does come in the sense that the entire worldview is shrouded in a tremendous amount of fear. So God to them is somebody primarily that is vindictive and that needs to be appeased, So breaking the rules, like the emphasis is always on God's going to punish you for deviating from the rules. So yeah, that's really important to understand as well, I think.
So it's kind of a combination of various people's ideas of what came to them and felt right, and has become more of a staple part of the movement over time. Perhaps there were some parts of African culture or that were included in that. I think I'd have to do a bit more research to know whether I'm on the right track with that or kind of just clutching at straws. I'm not sure. But another part that I thought was interesting about what you said around the wedding ceremonies, or the whole marriage process overall, kind of felt to me like there were Nexium vibes with the way that the leader stands in between the man and the woman. The leader proposes to the woman. Feels like there's like a really strong sense of ownership over that relationship. And in the same way that women would be recruited into DOS, into the secret society of Nexium, where they would essentially be sex trafficked and branded, it's almost like the leadership is establishing some type of ownership over the woman and the relationship overall by putting themselves in between the man and the woman, and making a point of existing before allowing that man and woman to even hold hands, or have a conversation just with the two of them. It feels very controlled.
Yeah, I don't actually know if that was the motivation so much as far as the group was concerned. Where it originates from is primarily an intense paranoia surrounding, sexual purity and that kind of thing. So rather than like, they wouldn't see it in an ownership kind of way, they would see it as these are the rules God has put in place to ensure that our young people stay sexually abstinent up until marriage. And so in their worldview, staying pure before marriage isn't only like avoiding what they consider sexual immorality. It's like you're not allowed to have contact with the opposite sex. So if somebody was found to be like texting somebody of the opposite sex, that would be enough for them to deem that person to be impure. So I think that's where it originated more. It was just this artificial attempt to regulate the whole dating and courtship process.
I suppose that's led us kind of nicely into asking about your particular experiences within this group. Where was this a movement that you were born into?
Yes and no. So I'll have to explain. So I was born into it in the sense that my parents were already part of the group. So I didn't choose to join it. But we as a family were only tangentially connected to the group initially and gradually became more involved. So by the time I was born in Germany, my mother was already attending the annual conferences run by KwaSizabantu in Europe. And we typically attended those conferences every year. So, but that was largely the extent of our involvement during the first few years. We were never even a part of one of the European KSB churches or schools which formed later, although my parents did consider enrolling my sisters and I in the school in Switzerland. And interestingly, one of the very latest developments with KwaSizabantu is that the school in Switzerland has just released a report showing that there was child abuse taking place within the school there. So they're currently in the midst of a big investigation as well. And so when I was 5, we moved to KwaSizabantu mission in South Africa, so the headquarters of the whole movement. And we lived there for a relatively brief time. And my mother worked at their radio station and my sisters attended the school there. And not too long after that was when we came back to Europe, and then we were only in Germany for another year or so before we moved to Australia. And it was really just a coincidental discovery that we realized that there was this branch of KwaSizabantu in Australia, and that's how we came to join that.
And your parents, were they both practicing members of KSB when they met one another and then formed a family, or did they find each other and then find KSB?
They actually got to know each other more through a Pentecostal charismatic type of background. So yeah, no, it was, they were introduced to KSB after they were married, and it was just through somebody like recommending a tape of Errol Stegen preaching, and then they discovered that he happened to be doing a preaching tour pretty close to where they lived at the time. So that's how they became more interested in him.
It's interesting that you mentioned Pentecostalism there, because at the start, when you mentioned faith healing and resurrections and exorcisms, my mind kind of did wander to Pentecostal practices, and especially with some of the more fringe sects of Pentecostalism, with the snake oil and the faith healing and the tent revivals and things like that. So I suppose if your parents were familiar with Pentecostal practices, moving over to KSB and understanding their beliefs around faith healing and exorcisms might not have been too much of a change for them or a shock to their belief system.
Yeah, I'm not sure that was it, because interestingly, KwaSizabantu was pretty condemning of the charismatic movement. And in fact, a point of sort of emphasis for Errol Stegen was the fact that he very much kept the healing and the supernatural elements out of a church service. So you would never see somebody like going forward to be healed or something. Right. They always kept that very, very private. It wasn't, I mean, it was one of their selling points in terms of the fact that they would share those testimonies and write it in the books and say, this is what God's doing. But it was almost like they were trying to set themselves apart from the Pentecostal and charismatic movements, because they realized some of the problems that existed there. So yeah, I think it was more the case that there was enough of an experiential sense of Christianity for it to be appealing to people that maybe came from that sort of background, but they avoided the extremes, particularly in the services, so that it also seemed like something more normal to somebody perhaps coming from a more traditional religious background.
I feel like perhaps is quite a clever thing to do. They share testimonies that speak to the efficacy of those practices around things like faith healing, but they don't outwardly practice it where anybody can see. So they say, we do have this, but we're not just going to show you how or show you what it looks like. We have testimonies and stories that speak to it actually working and being a true practice, but we're not just going to put it on display for everybody to see. Typical everyday commitments look like for people living at KwaSizabantu? How much of their time throughout the week was invested in mission work and church-related activities?
Yeah, so there's a quote from the documentary that was released in 2020 called Exodus, which is an expose of this particular group. And this quote sums it up pretty well. And I'm just paraphrasing here, but right near the start of the documentary, somebody says that, their lives socially, religiously, and economically revolved around KwaSizabantu mission. And I think that really is it in a nutshell. I mean, for the people living on the mission station, it really was their whole life. Every aspect of their life was invested in KwaSizabantu. So religiously, you had 2 services a day, morning and evening. Now, the services during the week were not typically attended by everyone at the mission. They would be relatively small gatherings, but the Sunday morning service was kind of the big event. So most people from the mission would show up to that. Socially, you had the school, which is called Domino Savite School. And that was, of course, for the children on the mission station. And the school was really the training ground by which the younger generation at any given time was indoctrinated with the ideology of the group. Of course, they had a normal educational material as well, but the elements of the belief system were very much instilled in the children, and often in an incredibly brutal fashion. So it was mostly in the context of the school that the systemic beatings and the humiliating punishments took place. And so those are a lot of the talking points now surrounding the investigations into the group, of course, as well. For the adults, there was, or is, I should say, a teachers training college. And I've heard recently that they're actually looking to establish a proper university on the mission, but I haven't seen anything publicly said about that yet. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. In terms of the social interactions, just in general, the friendships and the relationships were very much artificial because of the rules imposed by the group. So we've already talked about the separation of the genders. So you couldn't just fraternize with somebody of the opposite sex, even in a friendship sense. And even friendships with somebody of the same gender, they were very difficult because the mission placed immense pressure on the children to snitch on each other if they knew of one of their friends breaking the rules. So you could actually get in trouble if you knew of somebody who had broken the rules and you didn't report it.
Right.
Now, that obviously doesn't lend itself to very healthy friendships based on trust and that sort of thing. So then economically, I guess, most of the adults, I would say, work in the companies run by the mission. So some of them were more like volunteers who were housed and fed by the mission. Others were paid some kind of a salary. We've already mentioned the Equele Water Company and the agricultural projects. There was the radio station, which I mentioned as well. And that was just coming back also to the blurring of the lines between the economic interests and the religious interests of the mission. So, for example, I know of a case that went to court because they had hired a woman to work at the Equele company who had a child out of wedlock. And on the basis of the illegitimate child, they fired her from the job at the water company. Now, of course, in their worldview, that's an absolutely acceptable thing to do because this is a scandalous sin. But to somebody from outside the mission who is simply working there, they, of course, understandably and rightfully so, took issue with that and took them to court.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's probably an important point to understand is how much the lines were blurred in terms of these things crossing over.
And that again is going to be another point of difficulty for me to discuss, because I'm not sure of what equality acts in other countries other than my own, what they look like really. It's encouraging for me that you've said that, you know, she did decide to go, this individual did decide to go to the court and through the legal system, because that is persecution against her for something that, if you are not practicing a religion like KSB.
Right. Well, I think the essential point is that you can't terminate somebody's employment based on their decision to have a child, you know, in any context. So
Absolutely,
clear
that's
case,
it. There goes again somebody kind of perfectly summarizing thoughts that I can't articulate properly. So thank you for that. So there we kind of have indication that insular communities do exist within KSB. You've spoken there about how the jobs are primarily had by people, or the people have jobs that are primarily linked to commercial businesses that are owned by KSB. And then you have family members involved in the church and the church activities, and then you have the children involved in the school that is linked to KSB. So here we have sort of an idea of how difficult it might be if somebody is no longer part of that movement or has communication with family and friends in that movement, of perhaps not really having anywhere else to go. If they were employed by a company owned or run by KSB, and they had children in the school that is owned or run by KSB, and then decided that they were going to leave the church, or committed what KSB saw to be an irredeemable sin, and was then shunned from the movement, we're looking at a whole complicated set of consequences that come from those actions of the individual, which perhaps shouldn't be condemned in such a way. But I, again, perhaps coming at it from an atheist or biased perspective. And of course, a lot of that is what feeds the retention rates of these high demand religious groups. I guess there would be a question of, is it even worth leaving? There's sunk cost fallacy to think about. I've spent sort of 20 years in this movement, or I'm a second or third generation member of this movement. What would it look like for my family's reputation if I was to walk away now? And all of the things that come from, I don't have any further education or training. How would I get a job outside of KSB to support me and my family, or even myself? How can I afford to go on to further education? I have no money saved up to look for housing. So there's a whole string of issues that come with taking a stance or participating in activities that the church classed as sinful. So it's clear then to see why people remain so devout in their faith, or so scared to explore their individualism.
Right. And of course, it's important to remember too that, you know, the people that are part of KwaSizabantu, they sincerely believe in the doctrine. So to them, you know, their view of God is probably always going to take precedence over the economic interests of the family, or to some extent even the social interests and things like that. You know, and there is a tremendous appeal as well to feeling part of this close-knit community, because as long as you're looked upon favorably by the leadership and by the group, you know, there is this very strong sense of acceptance and even a degree of importance, especially if you're slightly higher up the hierarchy within the organization, you know. So there would be reasons psychologically that I think would keep people in the group as long as they're still believing in the doctrine and the religious aspects of the group.
You mentioned there about the well-being of members of KSB, and I think it's important to speak to the emotional and spiritual well-being of members as well as the financial well-being of congregants, because you've alluded to some of the scandals that the movement is currently involved in, and some of the documentary material and news articles that started coming out from 2020 sort of onwards around different abuses that are coming to light across different areas of KSB around the world. And you mentioned systematic beatings. So I suppose this next part of the interview does come with a trigger warning for anybody who may not want to listen to the physical and spiritual abuse of children, to maybe kind of listen with discretion or listen with care, or perhaps even just wait till next week's episode if this is something that you would rather not listen to and be aware of. You've mentioned some of the restrictions that were expected of members of KSB. Were you yourself restricted in terms of dress code, leisure time, dietary restrictions, or relationships? Do you remember any experiences yourself where you had one of those kind of interactions?
I got off in terms of the dress code in particular, just as a starting point. I had it relatively easy being a guy. I think obviously, the whole question of modesty and those sorts of things, there was a lot more about it that was enforced when it came to the females within the organization. So one of the big rules as well in KwaSizabantu is that the women have to wear skirts or dresses. And of course, they need to be an appropriate length and, modest, just to meet the requirements of the rules. One interesting one as well was that Zulu girls had to keep their hair short. I'm actually not sure what the rationale was behind that. It was just something that was taken as gospel truth. And so for me personally, the only thing I can really remember was that in the Australian branch of KwaSizabantu, at one point they really tried to discourage men from wearing tank tops because this was deemed to be somewhat worldly. And I mean, clearly no one had seen my arms, because I can assure you no woman has ever looked at my arms and felt anything except perhaps pity that I seem to lack access to a gym. But this was just something that the pastor got in his head that needed to be enforced. So that was really, the only thing. I suspect if you talk to my sisters or like women within the organization, they would be much more opinionated and would have much more pertinent stories to relate on that. I've already covered the restriction to relationships and marriage. So probably the other interesting thing was that interracial marriage was not allowed, even though you had a lot of Zulu people and white people coexisting. Now, again, the rationale was really just the leader would sometimes, when he preached, he would say that horses don't marry cows, and that was apparently sufficient justification. I'm still not sure whether I'm a horse or a cow, but his word was taken as such gospel truth that to question even one of these more tangential things was just unthinkable for people. So yeah, you won't ever see an interracial marriage at KwaSizabantu to this day in over 50 years of the organization existing.
That is definitely something that was on my list. You've talked about how men and women and boys and girls were kind of separated. In church services, did you have kind of men on one side and women on the other? And what would happen with various races as well? Were they segregated, or was there never segregation across different ethnicities to begin with?
Well, there's a couple of things there. So firstly, in terms of the segregation between the genders, something that was kind of unique about the Australian church of KwaSizabantu. So if you walked into the back of my church on a Sunday morning, you would see all of the single young men sitting down the front on the left of the church. Then you had the aisle down the middle, and then the single young women would be on the right. So there was this quite literal physical separation. Now, again, I'm not aware that that was ever like written down somewhere as, a rule. It just sort of, everyone knew that this is what's going to happen. And,
Right.
It wouldn't have occurred to a young man to go and sit down on the women's side of the church. It was just, everyone knew what their designated place was, and this just became the norm, With regards to KwaSizabantu in South Africa, I'm not sure whether that was a thing, just because the organization was much larger. So like a Sunday morning service was typically attended by a few thousand people, as far as I'm aware. Wow. So I suspect it would have been more that people were just generally sitting with their families. There's a lot, and I wish I had more personal experience, but obviously as a white male, I didn't experience this. I know there was a lot of discrimination in the sense that the Zulu children were treated much more harshly than the white children. And I believe some of that even included things like the living quarters and things like that. But so I've already mentioned as well that even things like the hairstyles and stuff, there were certain rules that applied to the Zulu girls, which were just not enforced with the white girls at all.
The conformity of sort of men sitting with men and women sitting with women, how does that reflect upon the LGBTQIA plus community? Do you know of anybody that kind of had a same-sex attraction or was involved in a same-sex relationship, and how that was viewed within the church? Or would somebody just, if they felt that way, or maybe not conform to their given gender at birth, would just never talk about it because of the consequences of what that might look like if they came forward with that information?
Right. It just wouldn't be something that you would be open about, I don't imagine, if that was the case. I definitely never heard about it or anything like that growing up. I think it was just understood that it was prohibited. And I mean, it's possible that people would have maybe like confessed, having same-sex attraction or something in the context of like the confession to the leaders. But, I wouldn't obviously be privy to that. So
we've talked a little bit about the shunning process and some of the reasons why a person might be shunned, or what that might look like inside of the movement. Have you ever seen this happen, or do you know of the effect that it has had on somebody personally who has experienced this shunning process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, shunning was very commonplace. It was well understood and accepted within the group. In fact, I suspect you would now be hard pressed to find a leader or a preacher at KwaSizabantu who hasn't alienated family members, particularly children, because what happened quite frequently is that the children would grow up. At some point, they would realize that, the abuse that they're being raised in is not something they want to be a part of anymore. And then when they become young adults, they would leave. So shunning would primarily take place because of disloyalty to KwaSizabantu and obviously leaving the group. So if you leave KSB, according to the leader, because this is something he said once, it's because Satan has deceived you. So that was kind of the justification for families shunning their children or their family members in general. It's that, they're being led by Satan, they're being taken away from God's truth, essentially. And so closely tied up with this as well is this idea that people leave KwaSizabantu because they want to be like the world, which in their worldview is a very bad thing. You're supposed to not be like the world. And so you would even hear stories where people would say, well, so-and-so has left because they wanted to wear jeans or because they didn't want to get married the KwaSizabantu way. And so it's probably important to note too that the shunning occurred irrespective of whether that person remained Christian or religious or not. So that didn't really factor into it at all. It's like, even if you went to another conservative church, you were still as much an apostate as if you became completely non-religious. So I've got a friend who left KwaSizabantu after growing up there, and despite still being religious, his family refused to attend his wedding because he had gotten to know his spouse prior to marriage. And this was a pretty common occurrence. I saw it happen within the Australian branch of KwaSizabantu as well, where you had like parents and immediate family members of a former member. They chose not to attend his wedding because he hadn't gotten married the KwaSizabantu way. So honestly, I've probably lost count of how many families have been split by KwaSizabantu. It would really be hard to tally that up. So, if somebody in your family has left the mission and you're seen to be fraternizing with them too much, or if you maintain a good relationship with them, you're going to come under immense pressure and scrutiny from the leadership, and you'll probably face a degree of ostracism because they expect you to alienate your family members that are no longer loyal to the mission. So probably the one other point worth mentioning just on the point of shunning is that this also just included expulsion from the mission. So even people who didn't voluntarily leave. So particularly of adolescent school children. So for example, I know of a lady called Ellen Pilo Malinga, who was expelled from the school and from KwaSizabantu because a man gave her a chocolate bar, and the leadership accused her of being in a relationship with that man. Now, she obviously wasn't, because that was against the rules, but they didn't wait to hear her side of the story. She was beaten, expelled by the leadership, and disowned by her own family as a result of this. So just to really drive the point home, this is a 15-year-old girl who's beaten and expelled for nothing more than the fact that somebody of the opposite sex gave her a candy bar, So yeah, in general, loyalty to KwaSizabantu takes precedence over any friendship or familial relationship. And yeah, it would honestly take too much time to relate how many times shunning took place over perceived disloyalty to the mission or its rules.
Must be devastating for people who are going through the experience of marrying what they hope to be or probably is, the love of their life, and somebody that means so much to an individual that they are willing to make the commitment to spend the rest of their lives with that person, to build a life with that individual, to have a family, to reach goals together, to be ambitious together, to encourage each other to grow, and to have a day where you celebrate that love and commitment to one another, and your closest family and friends don't show up to celebrate that union. That must be so devastating for people to experience that. And that's only one small aspect of this process that we've talked about as well. We've alluded to the types of difficulties that might come from employment or isolation or education for your children, or starting over without the familiar aspects of a new religious movement or a high demand religious group. But your wedding ceremony, just because you didn't decide to have a particular type of wedding ceremony, means that a lot of people that you want to be there to celebrate with you won't show up.
Right, and to the membership, it would mostly be about the fact that you're choosing to get to know your spouse prior to the wedding day. So they probably would be less concerned about the particulars of the wedding ceremony itself. It's more the fact that in their minds, even just dating or spending time with somebody of the opposite sex, even if it's your fiance, that's a terrible sin in their worldview. So if let's say you're a parent and your child, gets into their 20s, they leave the mission and they get to know somebody and get married, the parents essentially believe that their child is, very immoral, even if they've just dated or something like that. So that would be sufficient justification for them to have this outward show of disapproval, to say that, we do not endorse your marriage because you haven't followed the rules of KwaSizabantu.
And then what do divorce procedures look like, or is that just not something that you tend to see in KSB?
Generally not. The only time where divorce was, as far as I'm aware, was sanctioned by the mission was if one person wanted to leave the mission and the other person wanted was still loyal to the mission, the spouse that was loyal to the mission would sometimes be encouraged to separate from the person that was trying to take them away from the mission.
It's so hard to think about. It's so hard to, and somebody left a review on the podcast saying that I say this too often, and perhaps I do, but because I don't have a religious background, I try and put myself in positions or try to think about a time where I felt something similar or been in a similar position of pressure, because a lot of people that have never practiced a religion may have had encounters where they have experienced gaslighting or narcissistic abuse. Even if it's not faith-based, there is still spiritual abuse that can happen to a person. And there is still shunning that can happen to a person outside of faith-based groups. So I do try to put myself in people's positions to try and understand and sympathize and empathize with what that might look like. But I really don't understand here how you can be expected to make that lifetime commitment to a person that you may never have even spoken a single word to, especially from the woman's perspective, where she's told that she has the option to go away and pray about it and think about it. But of course, there is that unspoken pressure from the leadership making the proposal and all of those other ceremonial rites that come through with these wedding ceremonies. But somebody said to me a while ago, and you can't compare a human being and an individual to this scenario, but it was a metaphor that kind of stuck with me. You go window shopping for a wedding dress and you find a wedding dress, but you can't try it on until your wedding. And then you put it on and you take the tags off and you can never return it. And that's kind of like what these partnerships are like. You don't get the chance to go into the shop and try the dress on to see if it's comfortable, to see if the dress is a good fit for you and you are a good fit for the dress. You just have to see a dress in the window, say, I like that dress, and then put the dress on and never take it off. And it might be horrible and itchy and uncomfortable and restricting. But that's it. That's the decision that you've made and you can't change it. And if you do, there are consequences that come with changing your mind on whether you're going to keep that dress on for the rest of your life. And that is a person's life that we're talking about. At whatever age they make that decision, and if it's in keeping with a lot of Christian movements that encourage, the marriage between a man and a woman, and then for the woman to take on the responsibility of wife and mother of the children in the family, then it's generally at a very young age that this happens, from sort of 18 onwards. So to make that sort of commitment to somebody that you may never have even spoken to or held hands with or linked arms with or have spoken to at length to see if they have the same sense of humor as you or the same intellect level, so that you can have compelling and encouraging and exciting conversations. I don't know how somebody could do that and spend the rest of their life with that person. That feels so unfair and unjust to the individual to not experience finding somebody that you just connect with and that you fit with and that just feels right for you.
Right. Well, and it's worse than that, because of course, I know people personally who've ended up in abusive marriages because they didn't get to know the person they were marrying. From their perspective, they see the process of not getting to know your future spouse as a good thing. In fact, to get to know your future spouse to them would almost be signaling a lack of faith in God, because the way they frame the entire experience is that God's the one that shows the young man, and then God's supposed to also show the young woman. Now, again, there's a farcical element to this. I've got a friend who I'm going to recommend her book at the end of the podcast, but Erica Buonman, she said that she had 3 proposals of marriage before she turned 21, I believe it was. And each of those men, of course, claimed that God had shown them to marry her. So, just at a very human, pragmatic level, you have this rather silly situation in which, God is becoming somewhat confused as far as the whole process is concerned. But for some reason, that never deters them. It's still, the marriages that take place are still the celebration of God bringing these two people together.
That's such a good way of looking at it, especially then, because do those men, if they are rejected by your friend, go over to another woman and then say to her, God has shown me that you are the one for me. So again, and kind of again links back to the Unification Church in the way that kind of self-appointed Messiah Sung Myung Moon would say, God is speaking to me and creating these matching ceremonies of mass weddings, and he kind of looks at people's photos and pairs them together and says that God is kind of telling him who goes right together. And sometimes these people have never spoken to each other. Sometimes they're standing in a room and he just goes, you and you, or he did say you and you go together, and they could live on opposite ends of the planet. So it's really kind of, again, you look at this, and I've had a few interviews of people on the show who have had these matchmaking almost arranged marriages through Sung Myung Moon and the Unification Church, where they just have not been happy or been good fits. And at one point, Sung Myung Moon tried to pair one of the guests I've had on the show with like a young adult, and she was not a young adult at this point, so everybody was like, you can't match them together. They're like it's so different in age that it again is one of those almost farcical or comical moments, and in the end he just waved her away because he had no one to match her with. And if God is like speaking to him and telling him that he is, the person who can appoint these correct marriages, but then he's like, oh, there's no one left for you, so you can just go. Like, that doesn't make sense.
And that does raise an interesting point, which I think is much more serious. And I mean, there is a sense in which it's right to laugh at these kinds of rules, but the effect, of course, in the real life is very, very detrimental. So, for example, within KwaSizabantu, I've got female friends that I've talked to who felt that they were at a significant disadvantage when it came to finding a spouse because they just happened not to be one of the better looking women within the organization. And without the ability to even connect with one of the guys in terms of personality or shared interests and things like that, it was just everything being reduced to the external. You would just kind of got the short end of the straw if you happen to not be immediately physically appealing in some sense, So, it's kind of as silly as it is to recount the system. It's very cruel, actually, to the people that miss out. And in some cases, it's cruel to the people that get married too, of course. But it's very problematic on a number of levels.
That is something that occurred to me at the very start of the episode when you talked about how the kind of proposal element of the marriage ceremony unfolded. And you also mentioned that it's often outward appearance or status within a KSB. So again, if you're not born into or happen to find yourself in a privileged position within your family or the organization, and you're not outwardly as appealing as others might be to the majority, then you kind of are on the back foot. And that's again, that's not right. I'm talking to you and I have like crooked teeth, and some people might not like the way I talk, and there's like a number of reasons that people might not look to me and be like, wow, that person's the most outwardly attractive person in the room. But if somebody was to sit down and have a lengthy chat with me, we might find out that we have loads of stuff in common, and that we kind of find the same things funny. So, me and my partner, we just laugh all the time and we connect so great together that I feel in my like core so sad for people that never get the chance to experience that. And there's so many other things that we've mentioned about with just this one practice within KSB that is, as you said, problematic, because there is the misogyny within the religion that almost encourages or creates this space for there to be abuse within the situation. Within the marriage itself, you said that, you know, the woman is supposed to submit to the husband, and that includes the sexual intercourse that comes with being married to that person. So if you are to submit to your husband and they are physically abusive or sexually abusive, there doesn't feel like there is a space for the woman to be protected or to protect herself in that environment. And the same goes for men in that situation. If it's a male-led faith, then if the men find themselves in positions of being abused, whether that's emotionally, physically, sexually by their female partner, are they going to be comfortable or encouraged to come forward and talk about that abuse or to make changes because of the male role and the importance of the male role within the KSB faith? So there's a lot of things that are probably happening, that we know are happening in this movement, because they are coming out in news reports and court cases now.
Right.
And it almost made me think about, with the multiracial marriages that you spoke about and how they are condemned within KSB or how they just don't exist. It reminded me of an episode I released recently with Minerva, who talked about a sect of the Worldwide Church of God, about how they actually practice British Israelism, which is like a pseudo-archaeological belief system that a certain race is genetically and racially direct descendants of the tribes, the lost tribes of ancient Israel. And so it's racially impure for a white person to marry and be sexually involved with anybody outside of that particular race. And even though they reckon they have desegregated particular congregations within those parts of the Worldwide Church of God, it's still kind of frowned upon or forbidden for people of different races to marry. And then when you have people that convert to particular sects of this religion who already have multi-racial family members or children, there's that whole awkward conversation that's been happening in some of these congregations where the child is told to choose which part of their race they align with and then go and have relationships with that particular part of one part of their race. So if somebody is African American, if they have also white ethnicity, they'll then be asked to choose which part of their heritage and ethnicity they want to align with. So they may say they have to, in front of people, have to make a decision, and it's so uncomfortable to listen to on whether they want to date a white person or an African American. And then once they've made that decision, they're expected to stick with it. But imagine putting a person in that position and saying, you know, what race do you want to date? It's so archaic and backwards. It really is. And I wonder if you think that if somebody of multi-ethnicity was to convert over to KSB, if they would be put into like a bizarre similar situation.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I am aware of at least one person, but I don't know whether she got married on the mission or not, just off the top of my head. So yeah, I'm actually not sure what happened in those situations. It would certainly be an interesting question, and there would probably be people that would know more about the subject than I do. But yeah, I mean, the kind of, again, the farcical aspect of it was that this was based entirely on skin color, because something that happened frequently is that, you know, Australian people would marry people from the mission in South Africa, or somebody from KwaSizabantu Romania would marry somebody from KwaSizabantu Switzerland or South Africa. So there was definitely this intermingling of cultures. In fact, one of the problems with KwaSizabantu Australia was that the church largely consisted of one very, very large extended family. So the pastor was one of 11 children. So
Right.
that meant that most people were related. So at some point, inevitably, what needed to happen is that they needed to source spouses from KwaSizabantu around the world, which is precisely what did happen then. So you had a lot of kind of crossing over in terms of nationalities, but just not skin color.
Right. That is like a whole other problematic thing in itself, isn't it? But you spoke briefly about, and in some of your correspondence with me, some of the extreme punishments for children that take place within KSB, and some of the things that we're seeing now come through in these articles and court cases. Sometimes the punishments can come from children who have asked the wrong questions or broke certain rules within KSB. And I wondered if you could talk us through some of these examples of extreme punishment that you are aware of, that you've experienced, that you've seen, or that you know has been covered up by leadership and is now under investigation.
Yeah, and I mean, I like your earlier point just about, that this isn't in any way something that should be titillating or something like that. That's not the point of sharing it. I think it is important to give specific examples just so people know what we're talking about. But yeah, the beating of children, particularly Zulu children, was absolutely systemic, and by all accounts was a regular occurrence up until I believe 1996 was when they sort of officially externally outlawed it. So I in the process of the investigations into the mission, the mission sort of engaged in a rather farcical procedure where they paid a panel to sort of write up a report that was favorable to them so that they could get some of their economic interests flowing again. But even in that report, which was heavily biased towards the mission, the word that they used to describe the beatings given to children was vicious. So if a panel that is actually favorable towards KwaSizabantu is describing the beatings of children as vicious, that should tell you something about what they were actually like. I spoke to a pastor recently on the phone who left KwaSizabantu a couple of years ago. He relates an incident of a child that was beaten 70 times on his back. Another report that came out in the news was a 12-year-old child who was beaten 40 times for asking a question about who created God. And then in conjunction with the physical abuse of children was also psychological abuse. I mean, of course, physical abuse is by definition psychologically abusive as well, but the mission, the leaders, so something that they did on occasion was they would threaten to cut off children's hands as a form of punishment for, stealing sweets or whatever it was. And they would sort of do these mock scenarios where they would pretend that they were going to do that. And, I'm aware of a case where a child was made to stand on the stage and, as a kind of public form of humiliation and ended up wetting his pants, in front of everybody. So you've got these very, very extreme physical and psychological punishments. And it's important to note too that these beatings were administered for the most trivial of offenses. These are not some great big sin or something. This was, if you walked the wrong way or were obstinate or somebody thought you were trying to impress somebody of the opposite sex, if you were caught writing a love note to somebody, it could be something as innocuous as, clapping during the wrong time during a play or wearing the wrong clothes. The list goes on and on. The rules that the children were subjected to, the deviation from these rules just came with horrifying consequences. And so it was really a culture of dehumanization with regards to the children, I would say. And it was enforced in the most brutal fashion imaginable,
I wonder if this kind of comes back to a point that I was making before about how the the Zulu community, which I've had a read up and come to understand is the largest ethnic group within that particular part of South Africa and the Bantu nation.
Right.
But I wonder if there are different cultures, rituals, traditions, and rites that perhaps we don't understand that allowed for this particular environment of abuse to run rife within KSB, or whether the Zulu nation were also expected to adhere to South African laws that by that point had become kind of almost aligned with what we understand to be morally and ethically and lawfully correct in places like England and Australia.
Right, and this is actually a defense that the mission has trotted out recently in terms of, trying to justify some of these practices that they had in place. They've sort of pointed to elements of Zulu culture and said, well, we were just respecting culture. Now, that in my mind is an absolutely cowardly and reprehensible defense on their part, because what the arbiter of what they accepted in terms of cultural appropriation was not anything to do with respect of culture. In fact, some of the practices, and we can perhaps talk about the virginity testing a little bit later as well, because that was another thing they annexed from, or they claimed they annexed from Zulu culture. They not only did they not respect the cultural elements of these practices, but if somebody had come to them, for example, and said, dating is now a cultural practice, either in Zulu culture or any other culture, they would have shut down that idea immediately. So the suggestion on their part that they were simply, going with the flow of culture, it's really just a smokescreen that they're hiding behind, because they're not willing to take responsibility for the systemic abuse that was taking place, within their organization. And frankly, I think it's quite pathetic on their part.
I've spoken about this particular subject on the podcast before, in the way that refugees and asylum seekers that come from countries in the Middle East and Asia and some other parts of the world that practice female genital mutilation and have that as parts of their practices, their culture, their rituals, but then come to countries where that is illegal, like in England. There are cases where refugees are found to be continuing that practice on young girls. But FGM is not legal in England. And so the families are persecuted for that, for carrying out those particular rights and practices over here. So if South Africa has that same thing in place, where it is not legal to harm children, abuse children, batter children in the way that KSB seems to be doing, then it's not okay to then just say, well, that's what they do in that's what some cultures adopt and carry out in their practices, because the laws are in place to protect people. So, but then again, is that just my opinion? I don't know. Is it for me to say whether somebody should have their culture stripped from them? And we've spoken a lot about how is it then to say that the Jewish faith shouldn't carry out circumcisions on baby boys, because that is not, it's not giving the boys autonomy over their own bodies and decision and independent decision making. So there's a whole conversation around religious practices and cultural practices, and then the law, as in protection of people under the law, and what can actually end in people's arrest and imprisonment for not following the law. And Jehovah's Witnesses have covered up historical abuse of children and men and women, and then said that they have carried out their own internal investigations and they have found that there is no cause to go to the police. Is that then their decision to make? I don't think so. But then is it for me to kind of say what's right and wrong? Because I am one person that doesn't know these faiths inside out, that hasn't experienced them firsthand. So it's a really, really difficult topic to kind of appreciate and understand all sides of it and the ins and outs.
Right, and I should just clarify. So I do know that KwaSizabantu stopped the virginity testing and the beatings as a systemic school policy prior to it being outlawed. So technically, they didn't break the law in those things. But I guess it raises a broader question of, an organization that's claiming God as its authority and God as its source of ethics and morality. Why the lack of consideration for the dignity of the children who are the most vulnerable members of our society? So, talking about the legal aspects of it is one thing, but just because something isn't technically illegal doesn't make it right to do it, especially not in the way that they were doing it. So I guess that would be the other thing that I would put to them is not only do they need to justify themselves legally, but they need to justify themselves morally and ethically, particularly because they're claiming to be an organization that is acting in accordance with Christian charity and Christian tradition, essentially.
That's again summarizing all of those thoughts so articulately and correctly as well, and I think I completely agree with what you've said. And we've spoken a little bit now about the virginity testing within KSB, and we've mentioned that there is some sexual abuse that has taken place within the movement, but there are very strict measurements around relationships. And one of those things is checking if a female has had sex. And sometimes those virginity tests have happened, apparently anyway, with girls as young as 5 years old, which is just, I don't even know if there are any words, because even if a child at 5 years old was to fail that virginity test, how in any way would that be that child's fault? Which is just... And then what are the consequences for that 5-year-old child if the test comes back that they are that they don't have their virginity, which is just, I can't even, it's horrible. So what is your knowledge of these virginity tests? You said that they are now no longer legal. They don't take place as far as we know, but they have taken place before.
Yeah, so up until about 1996, I believe. So yeah, it became mission policy and particularly school policy. So at Vamino Savite, which was the school on the mission, and the mission's leadership has acknowledged this publicly. I mean, there's statements you can read online where they say, yes, this is what we practiced, and they sort of try and explain it a little bit. And kind of what we alluded to before, they would claim that they were just merely following the dictates of Zulu culture. However, I have it on good authority that this was not the case, as little of what they were doing was actually culturally appropriated. They went off and did their own thing. So the way the virginity tests apparently were administered was very sterile and unceremonious. And again, I need to credit Lempilo Malinga, because I heard an interview that she and Erica Bonman did recently where they gave an overview of the virginity testing at the mission. And basically the girls were just simply lined up after returning from school holidays, and then the state of their hymen was checked. And I'm not even sure that what the outcome was in terms of whether, if you failed or not, like what the essential point of it was, other than maybe just to instill fear, And I suppose the other important thing to emphasize is that, these children and adolescents, for the most part, weren't given any sex education. So something that happened at KwaSizabantu was that they would rip out the sections relating to human anatomy and reproduction from the biology textbooks, because they viewed sex education as part of like a sinful secular worldview. So, you've got these very young children and teenagers that are given basically no understanding of what this is even about, and then subjected to this very invasive procedure without any sense of consent on their part as well. And I mean, just if it's true that this was happening to girls as young as 5, I mean, how can there possibly be any justification for that? So the other thing that's extremely problematic, and I mentioned this in one of the essays I wrote, is I've also not seen any evidence to suggest that the leadership of the mission took the possibility of sexual abuse into account with regards to virginity testing. Because if you find, let's say, a 5 or a 6-year-old girl, where there's an issue, that the first thought is this child has been sexually abused, not this child is impure. Now, I just I don't know what they did in a case like that, whether they actually took it seriously and did the right thing. But in general, it was just, I think, used to reinforce the paranoia surrounding sexuality, and to sort of really drive home this point of the importance of purity for the young women and things like that.
I guess like the all-seeing eye as well. Like if you are involved in situations that may result in you no longer having your virginity, then we will know about it. But the
Right.
really angering thing about this, aside from the children, which it's just too much, I think, to speak about in depth, but it's like you can't check if a man's lost his virginity. So what is that all about? Oh my goodness, it makes me so mad. There's no men lining up to have a test done to see if they've lost their virginity. It's like the women. It's like the women are being told, we will find out if you have been involved in something, whether it was consensually or not, which is a whole other conversation to have. But where is there is no equality, and we are in 2022. How is it still a thing that women can't lead services, that women can't hold leadership positions, that women have to have virginity tests to see if their hymens have been broken, that women are not being given sex and relationship education so that they know what positive relationships look like and whether they are in an abusive relationship and what to do about that if that happens? And how is it that men aren't being given sex and relationship education so they know how to be a healthy partner, and so that they know whether they are being abused and what to do if they are being abused? How is it 2022 and so many of these faith-based movements are not incorporating this into their everyday practices? It's wild to me. Again, might be another one of those things where I'm just talking at it from a perspective of non-experience within a faith-based group, and it's so easy for me to sit here and say, why don't these things happen? But I feel like if religion doesn't keep up with society and make changes in equality laws and LGBTQIA plus acceptance of other fringe and marginalized community groups, is there going to be a time where religion dies out because people are waking up and realizing that they have a chance to be accepted for whoever and however they are in certain spaces in the world? I mean, in Liverpool, I feel like it has a reputation for being involved in things like knife crime and football hooliganism. But if a man was to walk past me with a full-length beard and a dress and high heels, I don't think I would turn my head and look twice, because there is like a huge LGBTQ presence in Liverpool, and pride is huge over here. It's a very positive environment for all sexualities and cultures as well. It's, as you said, a melting pot. In South Africa, I feel like that is in Liverpool as well. There's so many different cultures and ethnicities that all are kind of existing with each other because of the different universities that are all so close together. It's the only Hope Street in Liverpool is the only road in the world that is connected by two cathedrals. So there is a cathedral on either end of Hope Street in Liverpool, and one is Catholic and one is Protestant. And that, to me, again, is like things existing in the same space that perhaps in other places in the world would not exist in the same place. So how is it that there are so many religious and faith-based movements out there that aren't adopting these and this isn't universal, because I know that there probably are some that are making changes, but even just this week with the leader of the Mormon church coming out and saying the most racist things I think I've ever heard a church leader say on a public platform. How is it that religions aren't moving forward with the times? It's almost like they're actually going backwards in making sure that women and men are more segregated than ever, and that anybody that's attracted to the same sex is more evil and sinful than ever before.
I think in terms of like, if you're going to address the people within these types of groups with the intention of helping them to see that elements of their worldview are destructive, I think in a lot of respects, it's probably more beneficial to show them the inconsistencies within the framework that they've adopted. So I'm actually more passionate about trying to create a cognitive dissonance in the members in respects to even within the framework, the religious framework that they claim they adhere to show them that they're not living consistently within that. So, I don't personally find it that shocking that, say, a group like KwaSizabantu would adopt a position that was unfavorable towards same-sex marriage or something, because that's a fairly core tenet of historical Protestant Christianity. So, whereas I find like the marriage laws that they've created a lot more shocking, because those are things that you don't really find within the religious tradition. So I think that's probably a good starting point in terms of getting them to rethink elements of their worldview, is just to say, look, even some of the people that you admire, historically, would actually condemn some of what you're doing. Something just on the topic of the marriage laws and stuff. One of the very first instances of cognitive dissonance that I remember as in my mid-teens that got me thinking, maybe KwaSizabantu isn't infallible, is that I was reading biographies of well-known Christian missionaries and preachers and things like that. And I was reading about how they got married and how they chose to get to know their spouse prior to marriage. And of course, this set up this cognitive dissonance of like, here are these people that even KwaSizabantu would endorse to an extent, and yet they didn't derive from the Bible that one has to get married this particular way. And so, that I think is what was a starting point for me, and hopefully can be for other people as well, just to, with critique within their own tradition, the practices that they've instituted there.
And in terms of individualism and realizing that you may have interests and hobbies and things inside KSB, are you allowed to take part in sort of reading, watching TV, or using the internet on your own terms, or is it restricted, or is there kind of a set list of books that you're allowed access to? I know that it might differ in different parts of the world, but do you have any idea of what this is like in South Africa specifically?
So TV was prohibited, basically. I mean, they had the attitude that owning a TV would give you access to too many worldly and sinful things. So it's a no-no, basically. I read a report about the mission in which a former member of KwaSizabantu stated that the internet usage was monitored there as well. I'm actually not sure how pervasive that was. I'd have to talk to like other members that are still there, which of course is very difficult to do. But there was definitely a paranoia surrounding things like movies and TV and internet. I had a recent exchange with somebody as well who was excommunicated because she watched a movie that was deemed, sinful by the leader of the mission. And so, there were some very strict rules surrounding that. I also read an autobiographical account from a woman who grew up on the mission, and she stated that the mission's radio station was the only one that the membership was supposed to be listening to. So one of the more amusing memories, just on a more personal note, within Australia. So my mother was a lot more open-minded on certain things, and so we actually purchased a TV when we moved to Australia, even though this was very much frowned upon in general. And so something that would happen is if we had the TV out and somebody from the church unexpectedly came to our front door, there would be this rather frantic scuffle and skirmish to try and move the TV out of sight, into one of the bedrooms. So, and it's sort of something that just amuses me now looking back on it. But yeah, also realizing that it's sort of the level of paranoia about other people in the church finding out about this is kind of just interesting now.
Funny as well about how your parents, perhaps you didn't realize at the time, but had more of a liberal approach to their commitments to the church. If they were allowing you to have a TV, but know that it's not particularly a good thing if anybody else within the church was to see that you had a TV. So it's kind of interesting that your parents were in a position where they were kind of sneaking around as well, and doing things.
Right. So at this stage, after we moved to Australia, it was just my mum, because my parents separated and my dad was in America. And yeah, my mum is somebody that really represents a lot of the best aspects of Christianity, I would say, in a person. She certainly encouraged education, and she was just more open-minded. I never had the sense, for example, that we were in danger of being excommunicated if we wanted to date somebody or something like that. I mean, right. we certainly would have come under scrutiny from the church, but yeah, so she was always a little bit more independent-minded, maybe partly because, she hadn't grown up in KwaSizabantu either, so she had this kind of
course, yeah.
point of reference prior to becoming part of this that informed her Christian worldview as well. But just on the subject of movies and propaganda. So on the negative side of things, you had all of these prohibitions, but one interesting element of KwaSizabantu was the things that they really pushed in terms of the movies that they made you watch, especially the children. So one movie that just about every child had to see at KwaSizabantu growing up was a movie called The Burning Hell. And this was created by a fundamentalist Baptist preacher, I believe he was, a guy called Astos Pierko. And it's quite literally just this depiction of hell in all of its sort of B-grade horror movie glory, where, these incredibly distressing images were shown to the children, as young as 4 and 5 years old. And, with the stated intention, essentially, of fostering a fear of God and a fear of breaking the rules. This is kind of like, this is where you're going if you don't keep confessing your sins to us, and if you deviate from the rules. I was also at KwaSizabantu in South Africa in 2005 for their mid-year youth conference, and one of the movies that was shown at the youth conference was Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they had kids coming from all around the country, many of them without their parents present. And as far as I remember, there were kids as young as 8 that was subjected to, what the great film critic Roger Ebert called the most violent film he had ever seen, in this particular movie. And so, to add insult to injury as well, after the movie was done, I remember that somebody got up and reminded all of the kids in the audience that, this movie depicted when Jesus came in mercy, but, the next time he comes back, he's coming in judgment. And so there was this rhetoric again about, this immediate threat from this vindictive God. And so, there was certain material that sort of became entrenched in their kind of propaganda machine, I suppose. And so in addition to the movies, then you also had certain books. I already mentioned that the books that were written about the revival and the origins of the work. And I came across a clip which I found quite interesting, where there was a woman who was a member of KwaSizabantu, and she got up to say something in a public meeting, and she's holding up a book about the revival, and she's basically telling people that they need to follow this book because, you know, it's about the leader and he's the true man of God. And she's even encouraging people to essentially dispense with their Bibles because this book is you know, more important, and everything we need to know can be found from the leader and his teachings and things like that. And I found it kind of shocking because it's sort of cult behavior 101, isn't it? When you have somebody just saying, look, we need to unquestioningly follow the teachings of the leader, you know, and again, that's one of the things that's emerged in all of the news stories is the fact that there is this very blind, submissive adherence and obedience to our Lushing, and you know, whatever he says goes, regardless of whether it conforms to the Bible or not. And yeah, it's kind of confronting seeing that level of brainwashing in an adult woman, you know, that she believes this is the right way to do things.
And unfortunately, again, it's not unique to KSB, and is what we hear about all too often on this podcast when people come to speak about their family, their friends, their loved ones. But how, when, and why did you decide to finally leave KSB behind? And where do your allegiances lie now with any faith-based movement, if you kind of have those beliefs at all?
Right. Yeah. So I started questioning the teachings and practices of KwaSizabantu around the age of 16, 17. Initially, that was mostly in relation to the specific branch that I was a part of in Australia, because of course that was my sphere of experience. And I think that the first seeds of doubt really came because of witnessing mistreatment of members within the church, which was left unaddressed by the leadership. And so, you know, seeing some of the problems socially within the church, I think got me thinking about the teaching and the doctrine that was informing the behavior. So in short, I confronted the leadership of the Australian branch of KwaSizabantu when I was 17. I remember raising questions and concerns over some of the legalism, so the rules relating to marriage and clothing and the confession of sin. I also remember raising the concern that the church was following the leaders of KwaSizabantu too blindly. Like, I saw an element of danger in that. And the response I got from the person that was essentially the leader of the youth in the church was that, you know, I should have enough sin in my own life to stop me thinking about, you know, any problems within the church or the organization. And another sort of just something that comes to mind, which amuses me now more than anything, was that after I confronted the pastor of the church over what I felt was this blind allegiance to one of the leaders of KwaSizabantu, his response was just to get up and preach a sermon. I think it was the following Sunday, and he used the verse where Paul talks about, you know, people imitating him as he imitates Christ, and used that as justification for his position on that. So yeah, then in terms of leaving, though, the one thing that was extremely fortunate was that I was able to leave with my whole family, because through a process of conversation and discussion, we essentially came onto the same page. One of my sisters had always been pretty unhappy within the church because she suffered quite a lot psychologically under the teaching. And my other sister, she received a proposal of marriage in the way that I described earlier. And that was really the tipping point for her, where she, you know, that created a cognitive dissonance to think, well, you know, hang on. And particularly because one of the leaders from KwaSizabantu South Africa told her that, you know, after she turned down this proposal, she was told that if she didn't get married the KSB way and married outside a group, that she could expect to end up being married to someone like her father, which was a very cruel thing to say, because my father was emotionally abusive and things like that. So Yeah, that was, I mean, it was of course difficult for her to go through, but I think in the large scheme of things, it was probably good in that it made her realize that, there were problems with this group and these people. I think looking back, one thing that's interesting is that oftentimes when I hear stories of people leaving high control groups, it's often from a sense of personal grievance in the sense that they've been mistreated or something like that. I think what's interesting looking back is that that wasn't really the case for me. I left and started questioning because I sincerely believed that they were misinterpreting the Bible in a way that was psychologically and spiritually abusive. And essentially, I just felt that they were wrong in what they were doing. So once I developed that moral conviction, I was really fortunate to be part of a family that discussed things openly and that we were able to leave together.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you said that you were slightly different in the way that you kind of recognized your moral conviction and then decided to kind of double down and stick with it, but also different in the way that your family all decided to end your commitments to the KSB church at the same time too. I feel like that is not something that we often hear on the show. It's usually one person leaves and they are cut off from their family and friends, or one person leaves and they kind of have a little bit of contact with family, or one person leaves and spends the rest of their life trying to convince their family to leave, or one person
Right.
leaves and then another and then another, and it's a slow process until a lot of the family have decided to make a change from that high demand religious group or cult like group. It seems different in your case where your family kind of had that open discussion, which again, so thankful for your family, so happy that you were able to kind of have those open conversations, and thank goodness for your mum as well. She sounds like one of these people that we talk about on the show that we just need to take a minute to thank and recognize for being there and supportive, and it's just great to know that you were able to say to your family, hang on a minute, I don't agree with this, and they were there to either say, oh yeah, I agree with you, or they're there to say, I disagree with you, but let's have a discussion about why, and not to just say, I disagree with you, let's follow the doctrine without questioning, and that's the end of the conversation.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, it's to my mom's credit, that it would never have entered her mind to choose loyalty to the group over her children. So she was perhaps unusual in that sense, because there are certainly a lot of parents within KwaSizabantu that have done exactly that. They have prioritized the group over their children. That wouldn't have been anything that my mother endorsed. She always had much more of an openness even towards people that had left, and it wasn't this really black and white way of viewing things. So yeah, in a lot of ways, she kind of represented, I think a lot of the best aspects of what Christianity should be.
And what has your life looked like since you've made that decision to leave KSB? You mentioned that you've written a few essays, and you're here now speaking to me about those experiences. What did your journey look like going on to get your master's and then your PhD, and to be tutoring children to learn how to play music?
Yeah, well, I suppose like a lot of people coming out of these sorts of groups, I mean, it was a pretty arduous journey to say the least. So I started university about 6 months after leaving the church, and had a huge amount of social anxiety and just isolating myself instead of the normal interactions and making friends at uni. So yeah, it was pretty serious in the sense that about a year after leaving, I had a complete nervous breakdown just because I wasn't coping, and it was extremely suicidal for a year. And so that was, in a sense, probably the biggest legacy was the psychological impact. things like anxiety, depression, imposter syndrome, those sorts of things. But I did manage to go on to complete my undergraduate studies, and yeah, I sort of skipped over the master's. I did a year of master's and then upgraded. So I ended up finishing my PhD in 2020.
Wow.
And yeah, that was interesting because it was a real struggle for me in the sense that there was so much about the theological and psychological framework of KwaSizabantu that constantly leaves you questioning your critical faculties and your ability to contribute meaningfully to society. So that was particularly pertinent in relation to my PhD, where there's this expectation of doctoral originality. You're supposed to be making a significant contribution to your chosen discipline. And so that's where I really noticed the imposter syndrome aspect come into it as well, where you're just constantly like, you're almost paralyzed in the sense of the work process, because, there's this constant process of second guessing yourself. Socially, it took quite a long time to adapt to just the social norms in society, and forming friendships, dating, those were things that were incredibly daunting initially. It took me years, I think, to figure out that, and I probably haven't quite gotten there, but maybe nobody has, I'm not sure. So yeah, I think it's particularly difficult when you leave in your late teens or early 20s the way that I did, because most people, when they start their lives as adults, they hopefully have a foundation that's prepared them to become functional members of society. And with leaving a group like KwaSizabantu, it suddenly feels like you've had the rug pulled out from under you in a sense, and you have to start over. So, you lose most of your friends overnight. You suddenly have to rethink most of the values that you were raised to believe, were the most important. And of course, then you have to also figure out the answers to the big existential questions for yourself. So, but yeah, I mean, I suppose that makes the whole thing sound a bit bleak, but it's definitely, if I had to give a piece of advice to other people, it's definitely worth leaving still. I'm probably not the best advertisement for someone that's left a high control group, but there's a lot of people that really do find, freedom and a meaningful life that they can build now on a set of values that's more grounded in reality.
But what you said there, and dismissing your own worth and your own experiences, I feel like is almost another earmark of these high demand groups. And I've spoken a lot this week about how people should feel validated in talking about their experiences, and how one person's trauma and one person's experience of abuse, even if it might seem to others like it's less severe or not worth mentioning, that is another false narrative. And hopefully that's another stigma that we can break on this show, because everybody's experiences are meaningful and deserve to be listened to, and everybody deserves to be validated in their trauma and their abuse, no matter how they perceive their own experiences. So what you've just said there, I would like to erase for the record, and disagree with what you said, but we're not here to argue. So I guess a summary of our episode today would be that I'm not familiar with KSB, and that I think that's been pretty clear in this episode. My introduction to them has been through your correspondence with me, and reading some of the resources that you've sent over, that include your essays, and going to read some news articles that came out in 2020 about the scandal that's taken place with KSB. But in this episode, I think it's fair to say that I've made a few assumptions on the faith-based group, based purely on other stories that I've heard on this show that may not have been entirely accurate or fair. I think there's been a few conclusions that I've jumped to, or in terms of why certain practices take place within this group. Perhaps those assumptions came from the severe punishments that you detailed in your writing to me that do take place or have taken place within KSB. So perhaps then I'm coming at this particular faith-based group with a solid impression of what I believe KSB is all about, and perhaps that isn't fair, or perhaps it's right on the money. It's not for me to say. So anybody that's experienced KSB, whether it's been in a positive manner or a negative manner, or maybe a bit of both. I just wanted to kind of put that out there, that there's been a few times in this episode where I've made an assumption, and Daniel, you've had to correct me and say, actually, I don't know if that's exactly the intention or if that was the reasoning for that. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. But we have also discussed the high demands of KSB, the strange practices and doctrine that are in place that kind of feel familiar from other Christian groups that we've spoken about, but also kind of feel a bit unique and new and different. We've talked about the severity in the punishments that take place on the children, the shunning process that is included within KSB, and the extremely strict rules that exist, or to almost again, I don't know if this is me making another assumption, but it's almost like they exist in order to be broken, so that there is some form of punishment, so that there can be fear instilled further. But again, that might just be me coming at it with a preconceived idea of what KSB is like. Hopefully the historical abuse is going to keep coming into the light, so that can be shown to the masses, to equip us with education, to equip us with knowledge of what to look out for with other high demand religious groups, and the best ways to counter being informed about these types of abuses, and maybe examples of how not to deal with cases of historical abuse. So that's kind of what we've discussed today. But before we finished, I wanted to give you the opportunity to either mention anything you think we've missed, or to just go through some of those fantastic resources that you sent over to me, so that people may access some of this themselves. I do have some links that I can include in the episode description, and I would love to be able to feature some of your writing as well, if that would be okay with you. So I'll just kind of put it over to you, Daniel, to decide how you would like to wrap up our conversation today.
Sure, thanks. Well, again, thanks so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed the discussion. And yeah, so in terms of resources, there's a number of really good ones that are available. I mean, one good thing that's come out of the media attention is just this plethora of resources that's available now. The first one I want to mention is a book called Mission of Malice by Erica Blondman. She was somebody that grew up at KwaSizabantu, and she's very recently released an autobiographical account of growing up there. I actually wrote a review of the book, which was published by LitNet as well, if you kind of want to whet your appetite first and see what it's all about. But yeah, Mission of Malice by Erica Blondman. It's unique in the sense that it's a very personal account, and it deals with the very real life issues that people growing up in this and then leaving have dealt with. Secondly, there's a book which is available online, which can be read. It's called "Is This a Genuine Revival?" by a Dutch guy called Albert Pilon. He's a former member of KwaSizabantu as well, and he did a pretty thorough investigation of the origins of the group. And I mentioned earlier in the discussion that a lot of the alleged miracles and claims surrounding the revival in that sort of birthed the group, he was the one that did a lot of the debunking of this to show that that it pretty much wasn't what they said it was. So in terms of the more recent news stories and articles, the broadcasting agency that took it upon themselves to do the expose of KwaSizabantu was an organization called News 24 in South Africa. So they did an extensive investigation into KwaSizabantu starting in 2020. And as part of that, they released a feature-length documentary. They released 4 podcasts and quite a large number of articles which expose some of the abuse and the cultic practices there. So yeah, a quick Google search brings those up. Then there's also a website called KSB Alert, which is basically just a website dedicated to exposing the group. And that's existed actually for quite a number of years now. So there's a really large number of resources relating to KwaSizabantu, and it covers a lot of different topics, everything from the abuse to the theology, to some of the history of the group. So that's worth checking out. And finally, in terms of my own writings, so far the most substantial contribution is the series of 4 essays which I wrote. I've called them Scaring the Hell Out of You. And they are based around the role of fear within the theology and practices of KwaSizabantu and the psychological implications for children. So specifically, the 4 essays deal with fear of God, fear of authority, fear of self, and fear of the outside world.
That's incredible. That's fantastic. Is there anywhere online that people can access those articles, or if they come to me, do I have your permission to send those across?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm happy to send you the links. They're just on like WordPress. You can, I don't know whether you can include them in the show notes for the podcast or something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would definitely really love to do that. Yeah.
They are also available at the website I mentioned, KSB Alert, because the guy that runs that published the essays there as well. So yeah, if you Google them, they should come up in one form or another.
That's great. So there is a way to access your work, Daniel, and your contribution to highlighting the effects of KSB and the practices. And there's a wealth of resources that you've just mentioned there, and we will include some of those in the episode description so that people can go and access them if they would like to. I am in the middle of trying to update my website as well and including more resources on that. So I will now make a new section. Well, I say now, I will put it on my to-do list to add a section for KSB on the website that will include some of the resources that you've just listed there. And that is absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel. It's been a roller coaster for me today. I feel like I've learned so much, but I also feel like I know nothing at all. So this is a whole new thing to dive into, a whole new subject. And perhaps your interview here will encourage other former members to come forward and speak about their experiences. I would be particularly interested in hearing the perspective of somebody that grew up female within the KSB, because it seems like the experiences would be significantly different between various genders within the KSB. But also, it's been interesting because there's been the Zulu nation, and there's been the Zulu element of this episode to consider when talking about morality and culture and ethics. And I feel like that's presented a whole new hill to conquer or hill to understand in terms of religious movements that exist within the Christian and Christianity realm, but also include segments of other cultures and influences. So that's going to be like a whole new thing for me to try and understand and inform myself on. So thank you so much for bringing me your experiences, your understanding of KSB, not just through your experiences, but further afield, for coming on the show and talking to us about your family, your personal experiences, the experiences of others, and highlighting the processes of KSB and the changes that have taken place, and all the other stuff that we've mentioned around the systemic abuse, and highlighting that on the show, and for coming here to hopefully have your experiences and other experiences validated, and to educate the listeners on all of the stuff that we've spoken about today. So thank you so much for your time, Daniel, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening, because it's so late now where you are.
Yeah, well, no, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure to chat to you. I'm a bit of a night owl, so this isn't past my bedtime just yet.
I always find it difficult to wind down after interviews as well when I have them in the evening. So perhaps you'll be awake for a few hours now, reflecting on things, probably thinking, oh, I should have mentioned this and I should have mentioned this, and all of that stuff that comes with trying to switch off after such an in-depth conversation. But thank you so much, Daniel. I'll speak to you soon.
No worries. Thanks again.
Take care. Bye. That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I am your speaker, Casey, and this has been The Cult Vault.